Okay, the next question that the Breath Hub is asked me is, what are breathing habits in the first place? And what do we have to learn about that? Well, consider my posture. I know some of you who are just listening to the audio part of this can't see me, but I have a lot of gestures going on. I'm moving my head in a certain way. I'm moving my eyes in a certain way. I'm moving my hands very specifically. I'm moving my fingers in a certain way. I'm holding my shoulders in a certain way. I have a posture that represents me. I'm Peter Litchfield. I have my own way of sitting and communicating right now, and the way that I look at the audience and I look at people and so on. These are all learned habits. I learned all these things unconsciously. The way I speak English, the accent I have, the way my whole personality comes out in the way I move my body. It's the same thing with breathing. We develop breathing habits, and they're usually learned very quickly. They all have histories. All habits have histories. Like I remember one gentleman I was working with, a young man who was a track star, and he came out of surgery. He'd had surgery on his ankle, and he had difficulty breathing when he came out of the surgery, and there was an issue around his breathing, and he developed a phobia around breathing, and he could no longer perform his sport. So, no one really understood the origin of that, where it came from. I was contacted. I went to work with the boy, and he'd had this problem for about 6 months, and after about 3 weeks, he was back on the track field, because we discovered, where his habit came from, where he had developed the fear that he had that was associated with the breathing, and then we worked with him to overcome it. A COVID mask, for example, is a perfect place to learn a habit. A lot of people, when they put a COVID mask on, what do they experience? Air hunger. Does everybody experience air hunger when they put a mask on? No. It's just certain individuals who experience air hunger. I don't know how many. I did a presentation for dental hygienists one time. There were about 40 of them there, and about a quarter of them were not working in the dentist's office during COVID because they couldn't wear a mask, because when they put the mask on, they felt like they were suffocating to the point that maybe they were going to call for an ambulance. They felt like they just couldn't survive. They just weren't getting enough oxygen. There's air hunger there. And so then people learn to try to take more air. When they experience that air hunger, they try to take deeper breaths, and they believe somehow that the mask is reducing their oxygen availability. And it is reduced somewhat, but it's meaningless. It's a meaningless difference, that little bit of oxygen concentration difference. But they have the air hunger, and they try to get more air, and so what happens? They lose carbon dioxide. And when they lose that carbon dioxide, then the acid-base balance of the body becomes messed up, and they start to get all kinds of symptoms. And what do? They blame the mask. They blame it's an oxygen deficit. It has nothing to do with an oxygen deficit. It has to do with the overbreathing that they're doing. This sets the stage for learning a dysfunctional habit. So now when they get in other situations where they feel confined, then they start to breathe the same way, and they get the same symptoms, and they end up blaming those symptoms on other things around them. And the doctor that they go and see, or the healthcare provider they go and see, may think the same thing, to try to find out, why is a person experiencing these symptoms, with no understanding as to how that fundamental breathing process is no longer interacting with the respiration in a reflexive kind of a way. It's now being deregulated by a habit that a person has learned. And what you need to understand, a habit has a history. A habit has a trigger. There's always a trigger. It's not like you just breathe a certain way all the time. There are specific triggers. So in one situation, you're doing great, but in the next situation, your breathing is off the mark, completely off the mark. So habits are controlled by triggers, and they have outcomes. If they work for you, you do them. They're solutions. So that if I have fear and I'm in a situation where I'm stressed, and I take control of my breathing and I hold my breath, there's nothing wrong with breath holding, by the way. What it means to me is that you've taken control of it. And that could be an issue. I've taken control of it because I feel more in control. If I'm feeling stressed and I'm feeling intimidated and I take control of the breath, it reduces my anxiety. I feel more in control. I feel better. And that's why the breath habit is there. That's why every time I get into a situation where I'm challenged and I feel vulnerable, I then take it over. And there's a consequence where I feel more in charge. But as a result, there are all kinds of symptoms and complaints that may come about, which once again, then I blame on other things, which we'll talk more about here shortly.